first thing I'm going to ask is for you to set the tone. Tell us a little bit about this book.
Great. Thank you, and good evening. Lola, thank you for inviting me. This is my first Ake, and it's such a beautiful, inspiring environment. I'm truly honored. So my book, Dancing the Death Thrill, it's a historical novel set in South Africa and France during the First World War. So what happened is during that time, South Africa, colonial South Africa, sent 20,000 black men to go and serve on the Western Front in France. So, but I focused on one particular battalion who left the country in January 1917. And just as they were about to reach France, their ship collided with another ship, and it went under, and we lost 646 lives, but there were survivors. So I took that as a historical framework for a story I wanted to tell. Firstly, to bring this tragedy into the public domain, because in the history books that we read at school and university, that story doesn't exist. Yeah, so that's the background to the historical premise, and of course, and why I wrote this book.
And that's so important that we do that. So it looks like we've got two novels that actually are looking at historical events, right? So while you are looking for an excerpt to read for us, I'm going to ask you to answer the same question.
All right, my novel, the name of my novel is She Would Be King. And I should have also say thank you so much for having me, for inviting me. Someone asked me earlier today, they said, oh, you're a Liberian novelist? And I said, yes. And they said, but you spent a lot of time in Nigeria. And I said, yes, because my husband's Nigerian. They say, oh, you're a Nigerian novelist. And so I've been rebranded and it's been reframed. But my story, it tells the history, it's a founding story of Liberia. And Liberia has a complex history. Its history is made complex because of the identities that comprise the republic. And those identities are freed blacks and former slaves from America who returned in the early 20th century, or early 19th century, excuse me, freed blacks and former slaves from the Caribbean, mostly Barbados. It returned during the mid to late 19th century. And then, of course, the 13 to 14 indigenous groups that existed in that region during that time. So each of my main characters represents one of those groups. There's Bessa, she is Vai, and the Vai people are indigenous to northern Liberia and southern Sierra Leone, and she is immortal. And Junde is a slave in Virginia, and during his first encounter with an overseer, he realizes that his skin is impenetrable to bullets and blades, and he escapes the plantation and ends up in Liberia. And then there's Norman Aragon, who is the son of a Jamaican maroon and a British scholar, and he can make himself invisible. So he also sneaks on a boat, ends up back in Liberia. And the three of them meet as the nation is forming around them. Colonialism is still going on the rest of the continent. And then slavery is still true for other black people in the Western world. So they're trying to make sense of this pocket of freedom. And so I wanted to explore what would it look like to have a Pan-Africanist state, right? We have a lot of conversations. There's a lot of dialogue now, actually, about what that cross-cultural exchange would look like. It reemerges every century or so. In the 20th century, it emerged with Marcus Garvey, and it seems like now there's something, we're on the cusp of something now with Afrochella and Afro Nation and everybody exploring what happens if you put black people from these different places all in one space. Like, what are we going to make of it? And so the book is an exploration of that.
That's really interesting, and I think you should know that the other panel is actually Pan-Africanism, a history. So it's something that I often think about as well. And this sort of event shows that if we're determined we can actually just get on, because I think all the borders just come down. We're just people enjoying our blackness, enjoying the sense of community. But in reality, it's often, a different thing. But just as you were telling me and telling us, providing that little summary, it just made me think of the Avengers. Because it's like these guys sound like superheroes. Was that something that was going on in your mind?
I am a cinephile, and I do watch a lot of films, and people have asked me about the comparisons to the Avengers and X-Men and things like that. But really, I was just tapping into some of our oral histories. Like, I didn't hear stories growing up that didn't include somebody casting a spell or disappearing or shape-shifting in some capacity. So that's just how I understood the architecture of story. And so I think I was tapping into that. And I think Western storytelling taps into that too. Like these fantastic elements that are very true of how we understand beginning, middle, end, and story structure.
So are you plumbing the traditional stories and the stuff that you know and have heard? I mean, whilst in Liberia, is that where the inspiration, if you like, for what those characters do, is that where that comes from, or is it all?
No, so the characters' gifts are directly aligned with the group that they represent. Okay. So June Day's strength, paying homage to the strength and resiliency of African Americans and what they went through in America, what they continue to go through. Norman Aragon, his being able to be invisible as a biracial person. And then also I wanted to show some groups that had successful rebellions against slavery, and the Maroons are an incredible example of that. And then Bessa, she's immortal, and I definitely wanted to speak to the fact that yes, this nation was forming around her, but she's a woman. And I think and we touched on this a little bit yesterday during the panel, but before these lines were drawn in Berlin in the 1800s that determined that Liberia was Liberia and Nigeria was Nigeria and Kenya was Kenya, et cetera, you have people who deeply honor their ethnicity. So Vai is actually not just an ethnic group, but it was a country. It was its own country. Yes. In the same way that perhaps Ijaw is a country and Yoruba was a country, right? And that gets reframed. And I would like to believe that if those lines are ever rearranged and perhaps we become one country as ECOWAS, that people will still honor the countries that existed hundreds and hundreds of years before, which is what we know as ethnicities now. So her immortality is in direct conversation with that.
Wonderful. So I'm going to give this to you so you can start thinking about what you're going to read for us, and I'm going to turn back to Fred. So you can see I'm sitting comfortably now. So let's hear it.
Great. Before I delve into the text, I'm just amazed at the parallels between our stories. Your character is biracial. My main character is also biracial, except in South Africa we don't call them biracials, we call them colored. So Yapitso is a colored man who goes to war, and he's fighting many battles. His personal battle, because his father was white, mother black, but the father abandoned him. So he didn't feel he belonged in the black community as well. And that is intensified. That sense of alienation and marginalization is intensified as soon as he gets on the ship to Europe.
Fred, I think it would be really helpful, just by way of context. Can you tell us, in South Africa, what Wayetu is referred to as biracial? There's a certain way that that people talk about the coloreds, even in terms of their place, within the social structure, of society. So I've heard, for instance, as a non-South African, that you have the white South Africans who are in, holding on to all the, economic fabric of the entire society, and then you've got the blacks, and then they say that then you have the coloreds, biracial individuals. Is that true?
No, the hierarchy.
The hierarchy is different.
The hierarchy is different.
So how is it?
You have the whites at the top, and you have the coloreds, and then you have the Indians, and then you have the blacks at the bottom.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. And the blacks are in the majority. So before the ascendancy of the apartheid regime in 1948, We already had colonial rules and regulations policing racial integration or racial segregation. And then the apartheid government came into power in 1948, and they made it into rigid laws so that you couldn't access education. There are many attendant things to race and so on. But the structure is white at the top. They are the minority, the coloreds and Indians and blacks.
So this character then is, you know, enjoys a certain privilege.
Yes, yeah, when it suits him, he plays the colored role.
Card.
Yeah, the colored card. But of course, that does elicit him some privileges and rights.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to establish
that is very crucial. It's very important in the reading of the book as well. So yeah, I'm going to read from a scene where the title is Dancing the Death Drill. Remember, I said to you the story doesn't exist in our history books, but it does in our oral tradition. And according to the stories that we picked from generation to generation, as the ship was going down, these men realized there was no going back, but they didn't want to die like cowards, so they started dancing this death-defying dance, dancing the death drill. So I'm going to start reading. The ship was listing. Some white officers were running towards the flooded holds. Men trapped there, muffled cries. Some men so shocked they could not move, not even shout. They just stood there, screaming impotently, holding on to whatever there was to hold on to. Many could not swim, a fact discovered back in Cape Town when they were being drilled. They also did not seem to have any confidence in the life belts that they were already wearing. They stood frozen. Some of them had to be kicked or punched to get them out of the trance of shock and fear, so that they would do something to save themselves. Pitso cried, "Where is Portsmouth?" "Come on, man," screamed Truddy. "Save your own life. I have to know he's safe." Pitso decided there was no point in waiting for the captain to make the announcement to abandon ship. He ran towards the officers' cabins, but as he sprinted down the stairs, water leapt at his feet. The cabins were already underwater. He flew back towards the deck, cursing. He bumped into Ngavini, who shouted, "I'm going down to the prison. People are trapped there." Too late. The place is flooded. Ngavini rushed towards the hold where the dungeon was. He plunged into the darkness and disappeared. "Portsmouth!" Pitso shouted. "Captain Portsmouth!" He was running up and down like a man possessed, bumping into poo-poo. Somebody pushed Pitso out of the way, sending him sprawling on the deck. He got up. It was dark in the hold. He tried to find his bearings. There was a struggle in this obscurity to lower the boats. Pitso was finding it difficult to think because of the shouts, the whistles, the pushing and shoving. He elbowed his way through a wall of men, then helped launch number 3 boat. While he was busy, he saw a group of men lowering number 4 boat. When the boat reached the water, a full load of men jumped onto it. Just when Pitso thought the boat was stable, more men jumped on top of the men already in the boat. The boat capsized. Screaming and cursing, the men scrambled to stay afloat. Number 6 boat was launched, but the bottom fell out of it as it hit the water. Some men must have been knocked out of the boat as it backed. More screams. "He's biting me," a man shouted. After the boats had been disposed of, work went on to get out the 46 rafts, each capable of supporting 20 people. Pitso ran from where he'd been helping push men onto the boats below. He wanted to make sure that all his comrades were safely out of the forecastle. On his way back, Pitso noticed that the men he'd seen standing at attention were still there, still standing. He saw Reverend Joba, the big reverend towering above the men, also standing at attention. Pitso shouted in all the major languages of the ship, "Reverend, Mfundisi, Mruti, we need to get on the rest. Are you out of your mind standing there like that? There's no Jesus here. Save yourselves. Release those men. The ship is sinking." In his thunderous preaching voice, Reverend Joba cried, "Be quiet and come, my countrymen, for what is taking place is exactly what you came here to do." Somebody screamed, somebody shouted, somebody wailed. "You are going to die, but that is what you came to do. Brothers, we are drilling the death drill. The music of the alarm whistles shrill and thick. I, a Xhosa man, say you are my brothers. Swazis, Pondos, Basutus, we die like brothers. We are the sons of Africa. Raise your war cries, brothers. For though they made us leave our assegais in the kraal, our voices are left with our bodies." 2 gunshots were heard above the din. "We are drilling the drill of death. We are drilling the drill of death. We are drilling the drill of death. Hamba spocho." Pitso ran towards Reverend Joba, tried to pull him away from the scene, hoping that this would break the trance that these men were in. But Reverend Joba, a big man, simply pushed Pitso away. Pitso fell on the deck, grazing his cheek against a pillar. The Reverend then joined the rest of the men as they took off their boots. Still in a trance, they started shuffling their feet on the ground as they would have done at the funeral of a king or a chief. "You are going to die, but that is what you came here to do. Brothers, we are drilling the death drill." Like a well-rehearsed troupe of dancers, they lifted their right feet into the air. In thunderous unison, they thumped their feet on the deck, boom, in time with their muffled cry, "Ajik," drilling the dance of death, not crying, not panicking, not screaming at the approach of death. In Africa, even in times of death, people celebrate. Death becomes a spectacle, a moment of defiance, the defiance of death itself, staring death in the eye, facing or challenging it to a duel. "Come and get me, death. I'm not afraid of you." Brothers, we are dancing the death drill. We are going to die.
So good.
Oh, that was kind of scary, because to be honest with you, whilst you were reading, I was looking for references because I needed to picture it in my head, and I just kept thinking of the Titanic, you know, and I was remembering those guys playing the musical instruments, and even when everyone else was running helter-skelter, but here you are, you have these guys, and it's a similar thing where there's a way of doing things. That's what they understand, and that's what they stuck to at that moment, that they were in that kind of crisis. So I'm going to come back to you because I have some questions for you, but I'd like to go to you, Wayetu. Will you read for us, please?
Yes, I will. There were no Vai girls like Bessa. The coastal village of La had only seen one woman as cursed, Oma Famata, who they say is sitting in the corner of the moon after her hammock flung her there on her 193rd birthday. But even Oma Famata's misfortune was nothing compared to that of Bessa, whose curse was not only her inability to die, but also the way death mocked her. During the day, the Opa sat together and drew lines and symbols in the dirt that represented how many moons it had been since the last rainfall or the last eclipse or other wonders of the sky. They waited for the spirits to reveal themselves in nuances and uncover secrets of the land and its animals, among many things, like which Paro warrior would best lead upcoming defenses against local tribes so that the Vai army would return with cattle, harvests, and captives to help tend the village rice farms. The spirits also told the Opas to take care of the sensitive animals of the province, specifically cats. The Opas then divulged to the villagers the news they gathered from the spirits. Oma Nyampu never listened. Before Bessa was born, Omanyapu, old, bitter, widowed, was living only 2 houses down from Kati, Bessa's pregnant mother. Omanyapu had a pudgy orange cat whom she beat regularly to numb her loneliness. The village elders warned Omanyapu of what the spirits had told them about beating cats, but she disregarded them. She was powerless to her pride, and she hoped she would make the spirits angry enough to reunite her with her deceased love. When Kano, Charlie the fisherman's slave, knocked on Omanyapu's door to deliver her the fish that her nets had caught, the pudgy cat stared hoggishly at the tin bucket. "You will not touch it," she yelled, shaking the fish. Scales, salt water, and blood flew, and the cat dodged Omanyapu's warning. That night, when Kano finished his chore of cleaning fish for Charlie's wife, he blew the light from the last lantern away. The whistle his compressed lips made married the pungent smell of fish and journeyed through the village circle to Omanyapu's house, awakening the cat. The cat arose from the corner where he had been lying and probed the room. Omanyapu's leg twitched, and she snored expletives into the night. Alarmed, the cat positioned himself to run in the event that she leaped from her sleep to beat him with the redwood handle of the porch broom, but she remained in abysmal slumber. The cat proceeded toward Omanyapu's fish, disregarding the likely retribution on the following day when she would discover that her fish were gone. When he finally reached it, he lifted himself up to the rim of the bucket, careful not to scrape the edge with his nails. His eyes were large, his mouth ready, when a hard blow threw him across the room. "I told you, and eso?" Omanyapu asked, lighting her lantern. The cat tried picking himself up, only to meet another hard slap to his head. He stretched his claws and hissed at the old woman, but she struck his head once more and the cat shrieked. Determined to escape her fury, he scurried over to the fire pit. "Oh no," Omanyapu said, "you ain't going nowhere." She dragged him out from behind the fire pit by his tail. In the village circle, neighbors gathered outside of Omanyapu's door, baffled at what had made the old woman so angry that she beat the poor cat in the middle of the night. "I will teach you, you will feel it," she said. The cat screeched, unable to escape the bitter widow. Charlie knocked on Omanyapu's door, but she ignored him and continued beating the cat. "But she will kill the thing," said Charlie's son Safwa, an already handsome 5-year-old boy with skin the color of a coconut shell and eyes that were always asking a serious question. Inside, the cat lay in the corner as Omanyapu's stout figure and broom became blurry. Tired of seeing her, he let his eyes close and his heart stop and his mouth open. A frozen Omanyapu stared down at his body. She had killed the last living thing whom she could call hers and was now absolutely alone. She walked to her door out of breath. When she opened it, her neighbors stood in the village circle, holding lanterns that illuminated their overwrought faces. "Eya," Charlie said, astonished at Omanyapu's fearlessness. Upon seeing the dead animal, children scattered, returning to their houses. "The spirit's coming for you," Safwa said, the only remaining child in the circle. Yeah, bury it for me," Omanyapu said as Charlie looked inside of her house at the cat. He said nothing else to her and avoided looking her in the face. He called Kano to retrieve the cat, and Kano minced out of the village and into the woods, while a curious Safwa followed to bury the departed animal. In the morning, Omanyapu's house fell down while she was still inside. She died immediately. When they dug up her remains from a pile of palm wood, straw, and debris, Omanyapu's fish were nowhere to be found. Opa Bundo, who woke up every morning to pray before the rooster crowed, who had slept through the night before and knew nothing of Omanyapu's wicked deed, said he saw the orange cat jump to the top of her house before it fell down. "But the cat dead," Charlie said, refuting Bundo's claim. When the elders heard of it, they pronounced the day cursed, convinced that spirits had possessed the dead cat into coming back, avenging itself, and stealing the bucket of fish to quench its desire. So because of the edict, on that day, the drums outside of Kati's window were amply pounded. Her husband was already fishing at the lake, and she lay moaning on a rectangular pallet woven with large palm leaves and stuffed with straw. Kati would have her baby soon, so in recent weeks, her husband had risen before the rooster song and spent his hours at Lake Piso in hopes of catching enough fish to eat and trade in the village market. Neither Kati's father, nor her father's father, nor her husband or husband's father were talented enough fishermen to afford their household any slaves, so Kati had inherited nothing. At the moment she opened her eyes and heard the beating of drums, she pushed her aching body upward from where she lay. She was a dark brown woman with a slender nose and arms, whose breasts and hips had fully developed only in the later months of her pregnancy. She knew by the rhythm of the drums that either someone had died or someone had been cursed, both of which posed a gloomy birth for her unborn child. Kati's stomach bent in distress. The gray of morning crawled from the open window toward her sitting body and exposed thin streams of sweat that descended her brown face and arms. Kati rubbed and patted her stomach, pleading for her unborn child to tarry just a little longer in her womb. She extended her hand to the floor to drag herself to the window, but the uneven weight of her body made her baby's fingers and toes flex inside of her. No, no, extended belly. Wait, small, small. She pressed her hand on the floor beside her bed and tried again, this time successfully dragging her body off the pallet and across the room to the window, where she rested her back against the wall. Kati grabbed the frame, hoisting her body until her eyes uncovered the Baroque drummers outside. Salt and dust stained their palms. The opas marched around the drummers as their necks sank into robed shoulders. Kati knew what it would mean to have her baby at that moment, and she crossed her legs. Frightened that she would be seen, Kati collapsed to the ground, her body simultaneously hot and cold, her thin lapa imbued with sweat. She rubbed her stomach in great panic as her eyes canvassed the room for a solution to her disaster. Her pursuit ended with the door closest to the bush garden that led to the entry of the woods. Before Kati could move, a liquid stream of blood and water toddled down her thighs, chased by a more abundant outpouring that left her lapa and the floor around her drenched. To keep from screaming, Kati clamped her bottom lip with her teeth until she could taste her own blood. She could not risk them hearing her, could not bear the delivery of a child on this day, or else she would be forbidden from ever offering another to her village. So she finally resolved that she would crawl as far as she could into the woods behind her house. The baby kicked, ready to approach the dim light in the opening. No, no, Kati said again, as the floor beneath her continued to dampen. Her legs quivered. She clutched her lapa and squeezed. It was no use. The child would come. Kati dragged herself toward the door leading out to the woods. She used both of her hands and pulled her quavering body sideways. The child pushed. She squeezed her legs until her thighs ached from the resistance. Please, my child, Kati repeated. Wait, small, small. The drummers pummeled away outside. Wait, small, small. And Kati pushed open her wooden back door and crawled toward a huddle of shrubs. She panted, drained, and she tried to stop the baby, first with an intermittent tapping of her stomach. Then she reached one hand underneath her lapa to impede the liquid from where the child pushed its way out. When only several yards away from her house, at the end of a train of blood, with no more power to ignore the pain that pushed underneath her wet and sticky fingers, Kati fell onto her back against the waiting leaves. Unable to squeeze her slippery thighs together any longer, unable to constrain the willful head of her baby, Kati howled into the wind and sun. The drumbeat ceased. That was the day that Bessa was born. The elders declared that she was cursed. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. Can't wait to come back to you. So there's a question I have for you, Fred. Are we in Africa, are we now in a situation where we are going to have to write about all these events that are significant, that are important, but that have been written out of the history books?
I think it is a challenge that we should live up to. In South Africa in particular, there are so many of these hidden pockets of our history which do not exist according to the mainstream books and so on, which are coming out as now we've got the confidence, we've got the tools to tell our stories. Like the proverbial thing that says, unless the lion,
hunter.
So the lion is roaring now,
Yes.
so to speak. So the hunter is shivering in his pants.
But is the hunter really shivering? Should we focus more on other lions hearing as many of those roars as possible? Are we in, do you think perhaps that there's because I don't think you're writing this to poke your finger in the eyes of those who have made, it's really about these stories.
There was a void, there was an injustice. The tragedy itself was an injustice. And the fact that it was written out of history was a double tragedy. And there's one particular element to the story that even in the retelling of it, we forget to mention. I address it here. These 20,000 men who went over there were not armed. They were not given guns. So they performed all the logistical roles like telecommunications, offloading ammunition from ships, chopping trees, cooking for the white soldiers, and so many other things. But now the Germans, the enemy, did not discriminate. They just shot everyone. Yep. They didn't say, oh, no, poor blacks are not armed, so we can't hurt them. They just shot anyone. So that's one element that is scary. You send 20,000 people over there unarmed. You know, and then those who survived, when they came back home, the white soldiers were decorated. They received medals and huge bonuses and so on. The black guys, not even a medal to say, because the explanation given to the world, which stood aghast, why are you not honoring these men? And the response was, no, but they were not soldiers. They were cooks and so on. Oh, so yeah, and so these stories are coming to the fore. So in telling this story, my primary objective was to put it out there. And I'm glad since the publication of this book in 2017, some of our academics have actually done, because I'm not a historian, they've used their tools as historians to dig deeper. So 4 books have since been published, academic books now, about this particular tragedy, which gives me joy and hope that more of these narratives are going to be put to the fore.
No, that's incredible, and the truth is, it didn't just happen in South Africa. I mean, it happened across Africa.
That is true. Yeah.
I mean, when you hear of Burma Boy, I mean, we've also had that period where there have been books and stories written about the stories of those soldiers who were sent to fight, and like you said, many of them were unarmed, and when they came back as well, the trauma that they experienced, obviously a lot of them had PTSD, but of course there was no treatment and there wasn't much available to support them. Right. So Fred has talked about his primary objective. I think I'd like to know what yours is with this novel, because were you born in Liberia?
I was born in Liberia. My family moved to the United States when I was 5.
Okay, yeah. So you've lived in the US since you were 5. How do you come back to Liberia often?
I do. So
Very often?
I do. My parents moved back in 2012. I opened a bookstore there actually in 2015. So I go back quite a bit. And of course, as I said, my husband's Nigerian, so I spend a lot of time in Nigeria as well. So we're usually on this coast.
A bookstore, don't you also run a publishing house with a sibling?
Yeah, so my nonprofit is One More Book, and the goal is to publish books for children who rarely see themselves in books. And I started that in 2011. Yes, with my siblings, but then they said, oh, the book thing is your thing. Like, good luck with that.
So they've left it to you then?
Yes, but that's we have a team of interns and people who help with as associate publishers in development. And so the bookstore is an arm of the nonprofit, because we want to also create spaces, because what I found very quickly after opening the store is that I would, people would come in and say, oh, my daughter's in the 3rd grade, and give me a sheet of paper, which is a list of the Ministry of Education requirements. And so I say, oh no, we have novels here, and this is, a store where we sell books for leisure. And they're thinking, what's in? Because why would you have a whole store for books that people just read for fun? What kind of uselessness is this, right? Yeah. And so the Liberia that my parents talk about from the 70s and 80s is very different from the Liberia that I experience today. And I think we are having conversations right now about some of the byproducts of war, some of the byproducts of those trauma, how culture, how love, how the more romantic elements of humanity are sometimes a casualty of war. And sometimes, I mean, even in the United States, people are barely reading for leisure, right? Because you don't have time. But then you add the lack of time in a place like Liberia to infrastructure. If you want to read at night, but you don't have light, what are you going to do? Light a lantern to read? And different things like that people don't talk about. So creating a space where people can go and find that.
I just wanted to ask, you said something about the Liberia that your parents talked about and the Liberia that exists now. Because I know that Liberia was, I mean, the devastation from the war. I mean, totally unspeakable. I went to university in a place called Ijebu, and in the neighboring town called Oru, that was actually a refugee camp. So we had a whole host, maybe 2,000 Liberians who were living in what used to be a primary school. And I used to just kind of go and hang out there. And eventually I was co-opted into judging the beauty contests. And I found it quite funny because it's amazing how much of like American tradition, that whole thing around beauty pageants. It's,
Thanksgiving, there are things that we still have there.
It's really embedded in the culture.
I mean, there definitely is a romance when my parents' generation talk about Liberia. They say, oh, you know, there was $1 to $1 Liberian dollar, and everybody would come here. We helped everyone who was at war, et cetera, et cetera. And even from what I remember as a child growing up there, up until I was 5, I still have very, very strong memories. It was a beautiful place, and it still is a beautiful place, but it's still recovering, right? And I think what tends to happen with Black groups across the diaspora and across the world is it's sort of like this concept of not wanting to put your business in the street. That's done at a national level to where you don't want to show any scars. So you just, you know, you pat it up, everything's fine, we're fine, right? And you're trying to convince yourself, but it's like, no, you do need to address things like PTSD that you discussed before. You do
but
need
that
to
happens
address
across the continent.
mental health. Yes, exactly.
In Nigeria, even if you're dying or you're on your deathbed and you're ill and people say, how are you? You say, it's well.
Yes, exactly.
It is well.
Exactly. So then if that's at a personal, that's a familial level, what are the implications if that's happening nationally? Right? How well are we really?
Yeah.
As a country, as a region, as a continent, how well are we really?
It's a question we have to ask, you know, ourselves both on an individual level, but I agree collectively as well. Is our country keeping us healthy?
Yes.
The state that we're in, are we all even okay?
Right.
You know?
Right.
So I totally agree. But I wanted to ask you the piece that you read about this very intriguing birth of Bessa.
Bessa, she's the heroine. Yes.
So how this element of the supernatural, you know, that you bring in, is it for you? Is it an exercise in trying to reconnect with perhaps with Liberia in a very real way? I mean, but using fiction.
So the story, I would get told quite a bit. So a lot of the writing that I was doing when I was in college was about my cross-cultural experiences being someone who's Liberian but raised in the West. And a friend of mine said, have you ever thought about writing African fiction? And I said, you know what, I have, let me just give it a shot. And I would get told, my author's note implies when we were younger, my grandmother would say, be kind to cats, don't hummock cats, is what they say. Don't hummock cats. And they would say there was an old woman, she beat her cat to death. The cat's ghost jumped to the top of her roof and killed her. So that was our adage. You have to be very kind to cats. And of course, across the continent, there are various superstitions around cats.
This one, I wanted to say, I mean, in Liberia, is this like a general thing that people
No,
say?
this is a Vai. This is more specific to Vai people and more specific to the Vai village that my grandmother's father was the chief of. So they would, and actually when I revisited Liberia last year with the book and told, she said, oh no, this actually happened. Like, this is not, what do you mean? No, this happened. The woman had a name and everything. It was Saratu. And so when I was thinking about, I said, well, what if I flesh out this story? I mean, it's just a couple of lines, but what if I give the woman a name and the cat a personality? And then that took about 20 or 25 pages or so. And then after that, I was examining, well, what happens if somebody is born in that context? And then that's how Bessa was born. And then I thought, okay, well, then the story around her formed. And of course, she is exiled a little later on. And then that led me to the exploration of what was going on in Liberia or in the region at the time. And of course, it was during the period that the ACS repatriated the Blacks. And so that's where the story formed from, was this traditional story that I'd been hearing from when I was younger. And I would say that even though I left Liberia at a young age, it never left me. I found my way back. My parents found their way back. And my mother always told us stories growing up. We would read but then she would always make sure that she was telling us stories as well. And I say, the question about the speculative aspects of magical realism, I just don't know of any story I heard growing up from my mother, my aunties, that didn't have some speculative fiction element. And then also and that's not specific to Liberia or West Africans or Africans, because my aunties and uncles who married African Americans, when we would hear stories, it had the same elements, it had the same superstitious, so something that's considered superstitious. I think Black bodies have always been in touch with the supernatural, always honored our ancestors. It's just that during colonialism, during slavery, those things were seen as lacking civility, being unchristian. Even though during that time you have a swathe of people in a world that's run by stories like a man being swallowed by a whale, and then the whale throwing him up on the 30th day, or the entire living world fitting into a boat, and then after 30 days they're free from that boat, and someone getting raised in a chariot with fire. And this is something that Christianity was based on. This is how they colonized us.
Absolutely.
But then they tell us that our stories are undignified and indecent. And so it's a return to that form of storytelling. It isn't an introduction, it's a return to it, because it's something that exists in us. It exists in us across the diaspora, whether you're Liberian or South African or Nigerian or from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or a Black body in Australia. I think it's something that is inherent in us, but it was discouraged for too long.
Absolutely. And you know, somebody was telling me a story about Lokoja, which is a place in kind of the center of Nigeria. And apparently the missionaries went there with to start preaching to them, and said to them, a fish swallowed a man. And the men kind of huddled together, and then they told the guy to stop and told him he had made a mistake. And this white man is saying, what do you mean? I'm telling you Bible stories. And they said, no, the man swallowed the fish, and they had to kind of, and he kept saying, no, I'm telling, and they were saying, no. What do you mean the fish swallowed the man? So it's interesting. Yes. You're absolutely right that many of these stories that we've been told, this is, what we have to believe to make us live and believe a certain thing.
And during slavery, they were telling them it was fugitive to tell these stories, to gather together, to connect to anything that was part of your ancestral home, right? Yeah. And so what a glorious time it is that we have modes, both in the written language, as well as film, as well as music, that's reconnecting with that heritage that is collectively ours.
I think it's totally beautiful. Thank you so much. So I want to talk to you a little bit more, because you've now whet my appetite with this death drill and all that. But I want to know if anybody on that ship actually survives.
Oh yeah.
Okay, good.
Pizzo, the main character, survives, and he proceeds to go to France.
To Paris.
Yes, and well, I don't want to give the story away, but he survives and he continues to live in Paris.
So he doesn't come back home?
No, he doesn't. He's not one of those who came back home. Yeah.
So there were those who came back home?
Yes.
And there were those who stayed in Paris?
Yes. And
you're going to have to give us a little bit more than that. Just a little bit more, because I'm really intrigued, and I've read the summary. I've read the blurb, rather. I've read it on the back. I kind of know what's happening, but I want you to tell us a little bit more about this story.
In real life, in the middle of the war, there was a mutiny within the ranks of South African soldiers, because the black soldiers were saying, look, we've been attacked twice already, and we can't defend ourselves. Do something. So there was a rebellion, a mutiny, and some people were court-martialed and so on. So my fictional character, Pizzo, is one of the ringleaders of the mutiny. And then during the fighting between the white officers and the troops, he runs away and he deserts, and he ingratiates himself into Parisian society, changes his name, he becomes a Frenchman.
Right.
And it becomes a romance. He meets a French woman, gets married, blah blah blah.
Okay, there's something though that that was kind of playing on my mind when you were reading, and when you said they sent us to die Did you say something like that? Was it that? And I'm kind of thinking, so these soldiers, they're on their way. Was it the tragedy and the fact that they knew that the ship was going to capsize? Was that what made them come out with that statement? Because there's a sense in which it feels like they knew, since they were traveling, they were going to go and fight a war, that they were clearly inequipped. I mean, they weren't equipped. They didn't have arms. They couldn't fight. Why were they saying that? Did they have a sense of that awareness that they were going into a very dangerous situation?
They were quite aware that the possibilities of death were there.
Right.
I mean, when you go into battle, you know that.
Clear.
So now, when the ship is sinking, it becomes so real and so palpable that it is happening now, so we can't turn back. There's
Right.
no way of turning back. So let's confront death. Let us defy death. Let us grapple with death. So that is what this guy is saying. And these words that I'm quoting here are attributed to a real-life character who was a clergyman from the Eastern Cape. So he really existed. And these words, according to oral tradition, were uttered by him. And they've been captured in our poems and so on. But as I said, not in our history books. Yeah. So I tried to bring that to life.
How much research did you have to do?
Well, the sinking of the ship was covered quite exhaustively by the newspapers of the time in France and back home in South Africa.
Okay.
So I accessed those archives. So I read a lot of that. And then, another infuriating instance here. The ship that collided with the SS Mendi, our ship, the captain, it was a British ship, and the captain of that ship admitted, because there was an inquiry after the accident, what happened. He admitted that he had been driving too fast. He hadn't followed all the rules and regulations and so on. So how was he punished? His license was suspended for 1 year. That was his punishment for killing these people. So the court transcript is there, so you can even access it online. It's so exhaustive, and yeah. So I read that and I weave it into the story as well.
When you talk about the oral traditions, or how these stories, especially the stories about the black soldiers or sailors, I mean, how has that worked in terms of going to talk to people who were perhaps who had heard those stories? What did you have to do to really hear the African side of the story? Because everything else that's available was the history that was created and recorded by the West.
Yes.
And so that other side, I mean, I'm thinking of the complexity.
The other side is nicely covered in poetry. Lots of Zulu and Xhosa poets of the time. One of them is Mkai. He was a very famous poet of that time. So he wrote an epic about the Mendi. And so that triggered a lot of newspaper articles by black journalists of that time. So I harvested them as well. And and then there's a song, a choral song, from that time.
You're gonna have to sing it here.
No, I can't.
Yeah. Come on now.
Yeah. So yeah.
No, I was serious.
No. No, I can't.
Okay, so let me see. All right, I'm gonna open it up. I am sorry I have dominated the conversation in this way. Can we please have some questions? If anybody has a question, yes.
Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Sin, Sin is spelled S-Y-N, and I run Sin City NG. So my question is to you. Why do you think a lot of people don't learn from history, where even in present day, people who are supposed to learn from those who oppress us are those who are doing the oppressing? Where you see black people now oppressing blacks, people in South Africa now trying to oppress those who are equally black but from different countries? Why do you think people don't learn from history when they read stuff like this and see what black people went through in the past, and now you in the present century, you are still doing something similar to someone, you know, of the same skin? So why do people not learn from history? That's the question.
Okay, so that's one question.
And sorry, I just remembered one now. Why do you think a lot of people are comfortable? We used to have a lot of uprising in that time where something happened, you would just revolt against your slave master, and people were chanting "Nzobu, Nzobu," you know, everybody was eager to fight for their, you know, they were ready to die. But now they tell you they're going to add 50 naira to your credit, or they're going to remove 50 naira from your bank account. And we're like, huh? So why do you think a lot of people are complacent with oppression, and why do people not learn from history?
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you both to respond, but if I could just get that question up there.
My question is more about the craft. This is for both Fred and Wayetu. How did you manage to fit your character easily between the historical events? Or was it the process? I'm more concerned about the process. Drawing all your characters and fitting them right into those historical aspects.
Excellent. Any more questions? One question here.
Okay, so my name is Comfort. You talked about sort of this process of recuperating the stories that we've had to sort of like leave behind with colonization and everything. And there was this sort of comparison that you made, Ms. Lola, about the Avengers, right? But I've often seen your book described as magical realism. Nobody calls the Bible magical realism. And I was just wondering, like, what you feel about that sort of generic tagging of your book.
Thank you. So why don't we learn from history? Why haven't we learned from history?
It's a very unfair question. I don't think I'm the oracle with all the answers. That's just human nature that our memories are so short. Yes, I mean, South Africa, black people have emerged from a very tragic chapter of our history. And no sooner had we emerged from that than we started visiting untold misery on other people, for example, our neighbors from Zimbabwe, running away from their own troubles. And the minute they reached our shores, we started attacking them and killing them. It's very, very, I don't have a straight answer for you, just to say human nature is deplorable in that sense, because we haven't been able to learn from history, which is tragic. And then moving on to the other question about, maybe respond to, sorry.
Yes. So when you were asking that question, I thought to myself, okay, well, white people they slaughtered each other from the 14th to 17th centuries in Europe. And right now there's a class warfare, ethnic warfare in America, red versus blue. Why haven't they learned from history, right? What is us? When we say, is blackness a monolith? Are we expected to be kind and forgiving and understanding and accepting of each other in a way that neglects, as you said, the human tendency for tribalism, the human tendency for, in the book, toward the end of the book, there's a section where Jude, who's been in America, and he designates black skin as us. And so he has a problem with killing a black slaver. But his friend has to remind him that in that context, in an African context, us means something totally different, right? And I think that that's something that we can meditate on and find a way to grow from. Like the expectation that we are all going to be harmonious because we all have black skin sometimes is unrealistic, because other races are not harmonious, right? I think the difference with us is because we have this history of trauma, because we have been through so much, there is definitely a question of, well, we are equally traumatized, we have similar histories, why can't we get along? But as I said before, if we are asking ourselves that question, then are we asking the white people who slaughtered each other in the 14, 15, and 1600s why they're passing things like Brexit, why the red and blue can't get along in the US? Are we asking ourselves that question as well?
Did you say red and blue?
Yes, Democrat versus Republican. Yes, right? Yes, no.
So I was thinking blue lives matter.
No.
So who are the reds?
No, Democrat versus Republican. That is very much
of
a form of psychological warfare
I don't know
now.
why I didn't think of
yes,
that.
in the
sorry.
United States, but we're not thinking about it in that way. We're holding ourselves to totally different standards.
It's interesting that you say that because I hadn't thought of that before. That when we talk even about, when we talk about Black people, we are putting a huge burden on ourselves as, as a race, saying that we haven't learned from history or why we're not learning from history is perhaps being unfair to ourselves as well. Like Wayetu has said, we're human after all. And like Professor Jibrin told us in a session earlier, that to be human is to be quite disgusting.
Because I also believe that in 200, 300 years, when the human race, and the entire human race is a variation of different races, right? And it's not a thing of black and white because that number is so minuscule, then we'll find other ways to stratify. There are going to be other hierarchies that exist. And so I think if we start thinking about that, how do we exist within our current state? And within the current hierarchies that we've created, aside from race, then that is a more progressive way of thinking of our differences.
I totally agree. The question that the gentleman up there asked, he was talking about, was it about craft? Remind me. I'm an old woman. What was your question? Just trying to remember what I remember.
Yeah.
Give it to us again, just so help us.
I was asking how did they manage to fit the characters easily in those, and then they should try and explain a little bit about the craft.
Okay.
It wasn't easy, but it did happen ultimately. First and foremost, I'm a novelist. In as much as I'm dealing here with a historical, is this working?
It is,
okay.
But if you have to have mine. But you have to do this.
First and foremost, I'm a novelist, and one of the major considerations I take when I embark upon a project, well, I have to entertain people. In as much as I want to capture and pay tribute to these men, I have to also remember there's a reader on the other side. They must derive pleasure from this story, tragic as it is. So it took me a longer time to come up with the characters to populate this historical narrative or this historical frame. So it was a major challenge and a very exciting one for a creative person. How do I create this character? And how do I make them alive and track their journey across 2 continents and make them as memorable and as complex as possible? It was a very, very interesting challenge for me.
How long did it take you?
The writing, research, altogether 3 years. Writing and research altogether 3 years, yeah.
Would you like to answer the same question?
Yeah, I admittedly, I had an abundance of characters in a first draft. I had 4 main characters, and then 1 was killed off during an editing round. And so I knew the story that I wanted to tell very specifically, right? But I had to weed it down and really be critical of my own work and say, okay, what is absolutely necessary when it comes to that balance of craft and story and history? And so for me, it is all done during the editing round. Like during a first draft, it's just, it's like vomiting these thoughts and these stories. And then during editing, that is when I'm usually able to integrate the historical aspects, check myself, and then of course kill off unnecessary characters, unfortunately.
So a question for you now. I don't know if you've written outside the historical fiction genre.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I'm not familiar with your work.
Yes, so She Would Be King is my debut novel.
Yes.
I have a memoir coming out next June, and I am working on a novel now that will.
So you have what coming out next June?
A memoir.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yes. And so my second novel is contemporary.
Yeah.
It's contemporary fiction.
So that, my question was, writing historical fiction as opposed to other types of fiction, are there differences or considerations that get into writing historical fiction? Do you feel pressured to be faithful to historical dates and so on?
There's a book that I recently read. It's a book of essays. It's called Neoliberalism and Literary Culture, about how most writers, regardless what race they are, there's a tendency to stop after like 1950s, 1960s literature. And so there was a comfort for me in historical fiction. Like in contemporary fiction, for instance, you have to consider the things that everybody is doing in the meantime, like looking through their phones. People have an aversion to mentioning Snapchat in literature because they don't want it to be considered unserious, right? Or things that are very like true of our technological age. You have to mention things like Facebook, or so what contemporary fiction will usually mention is, oh, they were walking down the street with the face in the phone, but you won't mention the social media network that they might have been browsing through because it's considered unserious. And so within my exploration right now of the novel I'm working on being contemporary, I'm grappling with that too, because I do think that there is a hesitancy in being too modern, that modernity, for whatever reason, in the larger landscape of literature is sometimes considered not literate from the formal sense, and which is sad, because then it's, are we really recording reality as it is, or do we all have an obsession with wanting our work to appear a certain way?
Why don't you answer the same question?
Yes, I would love to hear that from you.
I want to hear your answer.
Yeah, this was my 9th book. I write both fiction and nonfiction. Whenever I'm approaching a nonfiction project and also historical fiction, I get a bit nervous because I don't want to get things wrong. In this case, I didn't want to insult the memories of these people, the sacrifices they had to make. I'm slower when I'm writing nonfiction or historical fiction. Because of all these fears and concerns and anxieties, So that was my major challenge. When I'm writing other fiction, I'm very fast.
Right. I think I thought about that as well, particularly the Liberian audience, like wanting to get it right, wanting to be fair, but then also wanting to be fair to myself and what my truth is, and wanting to challenge readers to see my story as something that's particular to my experience and particular to my biases as a novelist, right? And then if there is a desire to see more, maybe they'll go and look for other Liberian writers, and maybe they can get other perspectives of this same history, right? Because I think we do tend to place specifically African writers, the main ones, this is the definitive authority on Zimbabwe, the definitive authority on Nigeria. We still have, we all see Chinua Achebe, as things fall apart, not just for Nigerian literature, actually for African literature. And so I think that perspective could be expanded quite a bit, and challenging readers to do that, challenging readers to see that there are so many voices coming from these countries. And if this interests you, then don't only go to Google and try to fact check, because I know people do that. They say, oh, I was interested in Liberian history. I didn't know that it was so closely linked to American history, so I went and did research. And also that's why at the back of my book, I have a list of Liberian writers and academics that can be accessed for any additional information.
Right.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you some quick questions, and you can only choose one. Okay, your favorite. The one you enjoy the most. Fiction, contemporary fiction, historical fiction, in terms of writing, which is 1, 2.
That might be like asking someone to choose a favorite child. Like,
it doesn't matter, you still have to choose.
You have to choose?
Yes.
Fiction, contemporary fiction, and historical fiction. So what would fiction be?
Like what you're writing now.
Okay.
As opposed to
Okay.
what you kind of did here with She Would Be King.
Okay. So then if this is my first child, I would say I could be fair and say that it's my first child. So I love my first child. I loved the experience of writing this book because it was, it exposed me and it exposed the assumptions I had of my own history, right? My mother's Vi, she's indigenous to Liberia. My dad is Congo and Gola. His people were actually from South Carolina, and they moved to Liberia in 1871. And last summer, I had an opportunity to go to South Carolina and meet those who are descendants of the family members of mine who stayed in America instead of going back to Liberia. And I still, even with that very complicated and mixed history, and many Liberians are mixed, I still had a perspective of there being that binary one versus the other, because our history, when you think about who's written our history over the past, it's framed in that way. And even though there is a movement now toward equality and unity in homes, there are still jokes that are being made. And so I wanted to make sure that I was going about telling the story in a way that was fair to our history, that showed that there is stratification, there is national favoritism, but there was unity. Like that blackness we were talking about, we wanted the freedom to be able to determine that for ourselves. And yes, the British were there just like the French were. The British actually put a flag on Liberian soil, and those settlers had to go into the local groups and get soldiers and get people to help them fight, right? That's our history. So, and I stated this yesterday, Black liberation does not necessarily mean it's going to be totally harmonious, but we do want the freedom to determine and work through our conflict on our own, rather than having people come in and say, okay, you guys should get along, right?
That's the longest answer to that question I've ever heard. I just want you to know you've broken a record. Are you going to break the same record? So what sits? You know that thing where you're thinking, okay, what really works for me, where I can just sit and, get on with it and bang it out, and, which one's your favorite baby? I mean, in terms of the process, when you think back, what did you enjoy more? Or what form have you enjoyed?
Okay, my very first book was an autobiography, Touch My Blood. Came out many years ago. I still love that book because it captures, I got into journalism at a time when the country, South Africa, was in flames, literally. And I covered all the riots, people being killed in their own houses and so on. So basically counting corpses every day. So, and then I ran away from home. I went to Canada. And in Canada, they kept asking what is happening in South Africa. So I wrote a series of articles for the Toronto Star, for which I worked at that time. And then I realized still they don't get it. What is happening back home? And then I wrote the book. So it captures my own personal predicament, being forced to flee my own country, but also it captures the dynamics of a fast-changing South Africa at that time. So it's very seminal to me.
And it's called what?
Touch My Blood.
Touch My Blood.
Yes.
Okay, that's another thing for us.
That's non-fiction.
And that's non-fiction.
Yeah.
Memoir, autobiography.
Autobiography.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
and then last month, I produced a new baby. This is my 11th book. It's called The Longest March. Again, historical fiction.
Wow.
Outbreak of the Anglo-Boer War. 7,000 black people find themselves having to walk from Johannesburg all the way to Natal, 480 kilometers in 10 days, because there were no trains to take them back home. So I captured that story. And then 2 weeks ago, I did the march myself. So I walked 480 kilometers in 10 days.
Wow.
And so it was captured by TV and all that. So it's still very fresh in my mind. And of course, my my feet.
That is amazing. That's
Great.
amazing stuff. And thank you so much,
Thank you very
both
much.
of you,
Thank you.
for your generosity and for sharing your work and your lives with us. This is why we love. I was just gonna say this is why we love Aki Festival. It just feels weird being on this side as opposed to being on that side. But this is what I love about it, actually, when I can just get to know a little bit more about other writers, especially writers from this continent or in the diaspora. I want to understand how their minds work. I want to see what's going on in their heads and what's occupying that space. And this has been fascinating. It's time for us to now go and buy the books and read them. And of course, to say a huge, huge thank you to Wayetu Moore and Fred Khumalo.
Thank you very much.